King Charles III has many residences. Grand palaces and castles across the UK. But there's one place that he can really call home. Highgrove, his country house in the Cotswolds.
It's not giant Windsor Castle with its manicured lawns, and it's not Buckingham Palace with the changing of the guard. It's something far more domestic.
It's where he finds peace and serenity almost. It's there that he can truly and utterly relax.
Unlike most of his other homes, the king didn't inherit Highgrove. 4 decades ago, he decided to buy what was then a fairly unimpressive Georgian manor house, but with huge potential.
It was the first home that he could call his own, and because it was a bit of a blank canvas, he was able to transmogrify it and make something of his own.
What Charles made was an informal home and a spectacular 15-acre garden full of whimsical touches.
And I always love gardens that have been created by one person, because they are invariably a window into the soul, and you see the character of the person who created them through the design that they've made.
It wasn't just the gardens, the house was transformed inside as well, creating a relaxing space for his new young family to enjoy.
Diana, I think, wanted a very homely look. She wanted to make it cosy, light, airy.
The boys loved it. They had huge freedom.
These go-karts arrived, and William and Harry were very excited. But unfortunately, we carved up quite a sizable area of the Prince's wild meadow.
It also became a favourite place to entertain celebrity guests.
The Spice Girls were helicoptered into Highgrove, had a lovely spot of afternoon tea, and helicoptered back out again.
Highgrove is a different kind of royal residence. Now we reveal what it's really like and how and why it's become King Charles's most loved private retreat.
The King's coronation in May 2023 was without a doubt the biggest moment of his life. It's a hugely important, significant and solemn day.
It's the first coronation in British history in 70 years. It's the first coronation in many people's lifetimes.
It was a big strain, I think. I mean, the King has said that they enjoyed the day, but I have to say that they look quite uncomfortable at times.
As soon as the festivities were over, the King and Queen left London and headed to the countryside for some R&R. Not to one of their great palaces like Windsor or Sandringham, but to the much more modest and cosy Highgrove house. It's just 2.5 hours drive from London, but a world away from formal royal life.
That feeling after that massive thing of the coronation must be the most nicest, best feeling in the world, isn't it? I'm home, I can relax.
You can just imagine, can't you, them getting back there, kicking off their shoes, putting their slippers on, pouring a stiff drink and saying, whew, we did it.
So where exactly is this well-known laid-back royal residence?
Highgrove is in leafy, lovely Gloucestershire. It's a very beautiful part of the country. It's about a mile from the town of Tetbury, which is very beautiful too.
It's quite a posh area of England. It's very much the kind of riding, shooting, fishing domain.
Charles and his sons last month at his country home in Gloucestershire. This is where he'll spend...
The house, which has been Charles's family home for more than 40 years, had relatively humble beginnings. It started life as a fairly unimportant 3-storey Georgian country manor house. Built from ochre grey Cotswold stone, it was originally home to a local landowner, but definitely no one of royal blood or connections.
The house has changed a bit over the centuries, but nonetheless it's retained its Georgian structure. Some would say boxy, others would say handsome. 3 stories, rectangular, relatively unostentatious. I say relatively because compared to probably what you live in or I live in, it's a thumping great mansion.
Despite its unremarkable early years, Highgrove is now the King and Queen's much-loved private home.
Right, thank you.
It's a private party.
Security is tight, and they almost never allow photographers inside. But these images from just before the then Prince of Wales moved in provide a rare peek at what has become their inner sanctum. The front door opens into a large hallway, complete with marble fireplace, that has doors on both sides leading to the reception rooms.
It's got 4 reception rooms in the ground floor of the house, the dining room, the kind of living room, drawing room, if you will, Charles's study, and the library. It also has this really incredible fireplace, which has dolphins carved into it in the drawing room.
So a house designed to entertain, but not so big it costs a fortune to maintain. You don't have these giant kind of Blenheim Palace style ballrooms, etc., that make you feel like you're rattling around.
But what makes Highgrove really stand out is the incredible transformation it has undergone in the last 4 decades. Particularly the creation of over 15 acres of stunning gardens, planned and nurtured by King Charles himself.
Highgrove is an idyllic, amazing place. There's amazing variety. There's incredible trees, there's a sundial garden, there's a walled garden, there's orchards, there's a time walk which the prince laid himself personally digging it up. There's incredible topiary connecting it. I think that it's one of the great gardens established in the last 50, 60 years.
Those who are lucky enough to have been invited through Highgrove's large front door say the influence of the garden can be felt inside too.
The house is very elegant inside. The windows are almost always open because he's a great fresh air fiend. And the house bleeds out, if you like, into the garden. There's no sort of definable line where one ends and the other begins, and I think that's rather nice.
It just feels very homely, very relaxed, very informal, not too grand, not austere.
This is not Buckingham Palace. This is not gold on the ceiling. This is not priceless Vermeers up on the wall and gold furniture that you can't sit on and a gold piano that's worth, 500 million trillion squillion pounds. This is very much a country home where, Charles and Camilla have dogs. The dogs can run around. There's dog baskets everywhere.
It's friendly. It's not ostentatious. Yeah, you walk into the old Highgrove and you'll see his bits and bobs in a wicker basket.
There are wicker baskets that Charles can just pick up on his gardening shears, so just by the front door, that very grand front door, so that he can just pick up and go straight into the gardens.
Upstairs, the house has about 9 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms.
On the first floor, there are 4 bedrooms, 1 for Charles, 1 for Camilla, and each kind of suite of bedrooms comprises a bedroom, a dressing room, and a bathroom. There are 2 main guest rooms, the blue room and the green room, because that's their colour scheme. And then on the second floor, it used to be the nursery for William and Harry and for the nannies who would look after them. But now, obviously, William and Harry are grown up, so that's been converted into other guest rooms.
There's much more to Highgrove than just the house and gardens. There's a working farm and lots of space for the king's beloved horses.
He obviously has a huge love of horses. Highgrove had its own polo team, of which Prince Charles, as he was then Prince Harry, and Prince William were a member, and they stabled their horses there.
They're beautiful stable block with lovely horses' heads hanging over the doors. You just want to go and give them a carrot. Some lovely stone barns there.
It is a collection of all sorts of buildings, and they've grown over the years, really. The Prince has added the orchard room, built in 1998, and that's a real function room and somewhere he can invite all sorts of people and have events, just not being in the house itself, but you're at Highgrove all the same.
There's also an outdoor swimming pool, a 1981 wedding present from the British Army, and accommodation for the royal staff who live on the property.
They have cottages that have been used by staff throughout the years, really pretty cottages with sort of white picket fences, but also a more modern kind of one-storey building that staff have used as well.
Only the family's police protection officers sleep in the house itself.
The police room, as we called it, was very much on the sort of the top of the house, butting onto the nursery. I always enjoyed staying there, this country house, with a view across the Gloucestershire countryside.
The in-house police protection is only one of the many security measures protecting the royals at Highgrove. This is no longer an ordinary country house.
What made it even safer, really, was the resident police post that was actually situated almost outside the back door.
There's a police station on the grounds. There's a no-fly zone over Highgrove. It was added to a list of places that it's illegal to trespass.
And over the decades, the King's Garden has matured, overlaying the necessary security with a green veil of privacy.
What I think is the most interesting thing about Highgrove House is that it has a steel panic room in it. You have things like chemical toilets, long-lasting food, there's medicines, all kinds of things in there.
There's quite a lot in it, including the blood types of Camilla and Charles. So if something goes awry, you know, they've got life-sustaining equipment inside this panic box.
Because in the 80s, I think the fear was that there would be a risk of kidnapping of the two young princes. So ostensibly, that is why this room was built. William and Harry knew of its existence, they knew what it was for, and they knew that in the event of something going wrong, they knew exactly what to do, as indeed we did. But all I will say is that, thankfully, we never had to use it.
Actually, someone did get locked behind Highgrove's steel doors once, but not because of a security threat.
Well, we'll see. I'm feeling energised, but it's...
By all accounts, the only time it's been used was by Rory Stewart, you know, who was the Conservative MP and once tutor to Princes Harry and William. But he apparently once got trapped in it.
I'm not sure how that happened. Maybe maths just got so boring they decided to all play a game, but he has actually been locked in the panic room. He has been rescued, though.
Despite the precautions, there have been a few security breaches at Highgrove.
There were some drunk Welshmen who managed to kind of climb over one of the walls and kind of were sort of marauding around in the grounds.
Right, thank you. Okay, fine, thank you.
I believe that they weren't near enough the actual house to be convicted of trespass. I think they just got a warning. Since then, the rules have been tightened up, and I think that if you do venture on the property, you can be nicked, so I recommend you stay away.
I think the security breach for me that's a little bit more sinister was a man who was discovered within 100 feet of the house with a sack and a pitchfork. Now, he said that he was looking for scrap metal, but it was 4 a.m. and, more worryingly, King Charles and Camilla were asleep in the house. They were in residence.
Now, that's alarming, but, you know, thankfully that person was detained. I mean, that's the whole point about security. You know, it may well have been breached, but as long as it doesn't achieve the end result, the injury of whoever's inside, then the security has worked.
Thankfully, the only people who have got inside the building have been invited guests, including plenty of famous names. They often bring a gift for their host, and what better than a little something for the garden?
You think, what on earth can I give the king who must have everything he wants? But obviously the garden's an easy turning point. So Elton John, I think, gave him an Indian bean tree, a golden form.
Pierce Brosnan, in his Bond era, gave the king a magnolia tree, and Sting gifted the king hundreds of bulbs for his wildflower meadow.
It's not just celebrities who are welcomed inside the stone walls of the Highgrove estate. Since 1996, when the king decided to open his very private garden to the public, 40,000 paying visitors come every year for a guided tour of the grounds.
40,000 is an awful lot. That's a heck of a lot of people to come to your home. And I really admire the king for opening up like that. It means a lot to him to show it off, but I'll tell you, people get such pleasure from it.
It shows, I think, great generosity of spirit that you have a place which is very precious to you, which is your private sanctuary in the largest form, to open it up and share it. But gardens are to be shared. You can't make a beautiful garden, shut the gates and say nobody's looking at it.
Access to the gardens costs £34.50, or £98 if you fancy a champagne tea in the orchard room afterwards. The money, along with sales from the Highgrove shop and other garden events, goes to the King's Foundation charity.
I'm here as an ambassador for the Princess Foundation, and basically we're celebrating Windrush, NHS, and just anybody who's 75, or people who've done stuff in the community.
The tour's popularity is all the more extraordinary when you realise that just over 40 years ago, when the then Prince Charles started to put his stamp on Highgrove, there was no garden to speak of.
He's totally transformed it. He's made it one of the most spectacularly presented gardens in the kingdom.
It might be something of a jewel in the crown these days, but in 1980, Highgrove was a fairly uninteresting country house with no previous royal owners. So how did Charles end up buying this unlikely property, and why was the purchase so controversial? In the late 1970s, Prince Charles was the world's most eligible bachelor, an athletic, adventure-loving prince who turned heads wherever he travelled.
Look very good.
Takes you back.
He was the kind of playboy prince. There were lots of pictures of him associated with good-looking women. He was often seen in his polo outfit.
But by early 1980, the prince was 31 years old and ready to settle down. He had marriage on his mind, but before he picked a wife, he needed to find a home. As heir to the throne, he had the rights to the stunning Chevening house in Kent, a 115-room Palladian mansion, but he barely used it.
It was kind of in the wrong direction from London through lots of suburban traffic.
Another strike against Chevening was that this historic house and its ornate gardens were overseen by a board of trustees.
In other words, even if you're the Prince of Wales, you don't have free rein over your mansion in Kent. And this bothered Charles, who anyway felt, especially in the late 70s, that he wasn't master of his own house. He was the Prince of Wales under the Queen, with a pretty challenging father-owned Philip. You know, a lot of people sort of telling him what to do.
So that year, Prince Charles renounced his claim on Chevening. Instead, he asked his staff at the Duchy of Cornwall, a private royal estate that provides an income to the heir to the throne, to find him somewhere more suitable.
The Duchy of Cornwall owns land and properties all across the country, actually, not just in Cornwall, across 23 counties up and down the United Kingdom.
The Duchy has these enormous estates, like large amounts of Dartmoor, large amounts of the West Country, bits of the Oval, which are able to make profit from the land.
The prince asked his team at the Duchy to look for a house west of London in Gloucestershire, an area he already knew and loved.
One of the most wonderful counties in England, very easy to get to from London, easy to get to from Wales, just a marvellous, idyllic place.
So this was really a part of England that spoke to Charles in a way that Kent didn't. There was his love of horses, there was his love of agriculture, of biodiversity, and his friend group. And they were all based in Gloucestershire, his sister Anne in Gatcombe, which was a wedding gift to her and her husband.
His head steward soon spotted an advertisement for Highgrove. The property wasn't very grand, but it included 347 acres of land, woodland and a small farm, situated a mile southwest of picturesque Tetbury.
When Prince Charles is shown the listing for Highgrove, it's exactly what he's looking for. It's a smaller country house. It has 9 bedrooms. It also has substantial land, but not cultivated or curated land. So it is something that he would be able to mould into the kind of estate and farm and home that he wants to.
The listing and its potential got the prince's attention. He wanted to know more about Highgrove. This wasn't a typical royal property with a long family history.
There was no kind of, Queen Victoria had a bath here, King George died there. There was none of that ghosts of Christmas past, if you like.
Highgrove was built in 1796 to 98, the height of the Georgian era, for a man with the unusual name of John Paul Paul.
The Pauls were of Huguenot descent. They have the land by the late Georgian period, but in order to afford the building of the house, you need a good marriage, which is what John Paul Paul achieves. Hence, you get the commission of Highgrove in the late 1790s.
It's believed Highgrove was built by Anthony Keck, a popular local mason architect who designed lots of similar houses in the local area.
It's okay, don't go to Wikipedia if you haven't heard of him. Lots of people haven't. He was local. He predominantly designed local houses, about 50 of them.
He's a very safe pair of hands, and when he does a good job for one family building their home, they recommend him to another family, and so on and so on.
At Highgrove, Keck created an elegant but simple country manor house with a distinctive Venetian arched window above the front door. Although modest by royal standards, it would have been an impressive home for a country gentleman and his family, large enough to host balls and entertain the local gentry.
This was a house that spoke to individuals who were part of the great and the good. Not the top rung of aristocracy. They were part of that class that looks after the community, magistrates, justice of the peace, so forth. The events they would have put on, the balls they would have held, the shoots they would have had, would have been high points in the local calendar.
The house continued to play its part in the life of the county set for nearly a century, until in 1893, a disastrous fire gutted the interiors and caused some of the building to collapse.
After the 1893 fire, major restoration work needs done for Highgrove. The astronomical sum of £6,000 is spent on the renovations. Unfortunately, the owner doesn't quite get his money's worth.
There's quite a shoddy refurb that goes on. There's this sort of balustrade around the top that's solid and uncomely. I think that later Charles refers to it as austere, or a word to that effect.
Highgrove seemed destined to become an increasingly unimportant country seat until the 1960s, when it was sold for £89,000 to a prominent political family.
Highgrove takes a bit of a step up in the social hierarchy of country houses when it's bought by a trust of the Macmillan family. It's bought from Maurice Macmillan, who is a son of the Tory Prime Minister Harold Macmillan.
Good evening. This afternoon, the Queen did me the great honour to ask me to form a government.
Like his father, Maurice Macmillan was a Conservative MP and would later serve as a cabinet minister. The family's importance meant the house was now visited by some very prestigious guests, including its future owner's mother.
During Maurice Macmillan's time at Highgrove, some of his visitors included Queen Elizabeth II and the Queen Mother. And we know this from a throwaway comment that's made by the Macmillan family's nanny years later to the then Prince Charles.
That the fender Prince Charles was leaning on had also been sat on by his mother and his grandmother, the late Queen Mother.
Under the Macmillans, Highgrove wasn't just home to a British Prime Minister's son, it also housed the son of an American president.
It speaks to the almost celebrity that the house acquires under the Macmillans, that in 1975, for a year, General Elliott Roosevelt, that is incidentally the son of the famous President Roosevelt, who was Churchill's ally during World War II, he comes to live in Highgrove.
Roosevelt was an author who lived in England, and the Macmillans rented Highgrove to him for that year.
Unfortunately, it wasn't just the great and the good who became aware of Highgrove in the 1970s.
What was the first you knew of the raiders? Well, 3 men armed, brandishing revolvers, or pistols rather, burst into the room.
There is a spate of country house robberies in the 1970s, and in many cases, these country houses have relied on the invisible walls of the class system keeping people out. As that declines in the 1970s, houses like Highgrove are hopelessly unprotected for when it comes to a crime spree.
In 1976, thieves broke into Highgrove and made off with 2 artworks, a carriage clock and some small pieces of silver. But this wasn't the first time the house had been raided.
We know that because the Macmillans joke, oh, well, they were probably looking for the silver, but they didn't find it because that was taken in the first burglary.
So it shows you just how frequent these robberies were in the 1970s and how the landed classes and the aristocracy still weren't really catching up to how they needed to improve their security systems.
It wasn't just the house's security system that needed an update. By the time the Macmillans put it on the market in 1980, Highgrove and its gardens was somewhat neglected.
But they didn't do much with the house. They weren't interested in gardening.
When I first saw Highgrove, I was sort of 13 or 14 years old. It was just the lovely rambling country house, the kitchen with a sort of Aga flagstone floor. There was nothing that you could describe as an impressive garden. Even me, age 13, 14, you know, you realised that they weren't out deadheading the roses every night. Probably weren't any roses to deadhead. It was just an also-ran garden that you sort of blinked on passing.
Despite this, when Charles visited in early 1980, he fell in love with the place.
It was sort of nice room proportions, lovely vistas, including the spire of Tetbury Church.
He loved the surrounding wood pastures, the sort of trees in the parkland. But I think primarily it was the fact that he could do almost anything with it. He could really make the house look something special. With a bit of imagination, he could really do something with the garden. He could carve out a home that he wanted.
Charles also fell for Paddy Whiteland, the irreverent Irish groom who'd been running the estate for many years.
He was a survivor of the Second World War. He'd been in a prison war camp. He was an Irishman who just captured the king's heart straight away.
He understood the way in which Highgrove worked and what you want when you move into a house like that, which is more than a house, it's an estate and a business and a farm. You need continuity. You can't put everything up by the roots straight away. And Charles, who can't live there full time because he's the Prince of Wales, needs someone he can rely on and trust, someone who'll talk truth to power, which, by the way, Paddy did.
And when he saw Prince Charles, I think on one of those first occasions, Charles, who sometimes rode as an amateur at races, he said, "I saw yous ride at Chepstow the other day. I thought you was going to fall off by the way your legs was flapping."
Prince Charles was sold. He asked the duchy to put an offer in for Highgrove.
They exchanged contracts on the 29th of September 1980, which is a traditional day when farms change hands.
For £865,000, Highgrove now belonged to the Duchy of Cornwall, with Prince Charles named resident for life.
To raise the money for Highgrove, the duchy liquidated some assets. They sold 3 other country properties that they had and various agricultural properties. In that way, funds were generated to purchase Highgrove without having to have any recourse to the public purse.
Still, the purchase was controversial. Chevening Trust had already spent £1 million to prepare that property for the prince. Now the duchy was spending more money on a new home for Charles.
He has the right to take a view, and so have we.
One of the major critics of the Highgrove purchase was the Labour MP for Wood Green, Reg Race, who described it as an outrage that the Highgrove had been purchased, even with duchy money, at the time it had been, given the Prime Minister's policies towards cutting back public spending, because Highgrove would require a significant amount of public money to make it safe and also to provide the around-the-clock police protection that it would henceforth require.
And in response, a spokesperson at the Duchy of Cornwall says, well, you know, he only has apartments in Buckingham Palace and in Windsor Castle. Well, at 31, you want a place of your own.
But there was possibly another reason Charles wanted to buy Highgrove.
What's telling about the purchase of Highgrove is that rather than Charles getting in there with a paintbrush and stipulating how he wants it to be decorated, he says, magnolia, whitewash it, leave the walls as a blank canvas.
There's not really a great stamp of his personality, and that leads to speculation that he thinks that soon there is going to be a woman at his side, a wife, who will want to redecorate Highgrove as she sees fit.
Prince Charles was about to introduce his new girlfriend to the house of his dreams, but would she share his vision for the humble country house? In February 1981, Highgrove got a special mention in Prince Charles and Lady Diana's engagement announcement.
Are you planning, you must be planning for the future, where you're going to live and this sort of thing?
I mean, I've got this house in Gloucestershire, which I acquired last year. There's a lot to be done. It's going to be marvellous to have somebody to help sort it out.
4 months earlier, Charles had taken Diana to Highgrove and made a special request of his then-girlfriend.
He asked her to mastermind the decoration, really. She was a little taken aback, actually, because we weren't even engaged, and I thought it was really rather improper to ask me to do this, but he clearly liked my taste.
Rather than turning to a traditional royal decorator to help her with Highgrove, Diana hired a South African interior designer named Dudley Poplak.
Dudley Poplak's style was really a light-hearted take on grand English country house style with a fresh palette of colours, greens, yellows, whites, that would really have brought the interiors of Highgrove to life.
Diana, I think, wanted a very homely look. She wasn't looking for a regal residence. She wanted to make it cosy, light, airy.
It was quite fresh. It was like accents of lime and lemon, yellow walls. It was comfortable sofas with lots of scatter cushions. Charles is a very accomplished artist, actually. So there's lots of paintings of his on the wall.
Only one public photograph has ever been released from inside Highgrove after it was decorated, showing a small corner of the sitting room.
This very much speaks to the ideas of privacy that Highgrove's always been invested with since the Prince of Wales has taken over ownership. But we do have images of Kensington Palace at this time in the 1980s, when it was the same interior designer, Dudley Poplak, and overseen by the same princess, Diana. And if you look at those pictures, it speaks to the 1980s in so many ways. OTT, frills, chintzy, bright colours, scatter cushions. Not only is no expense spared, but also this isn't about restful, beige, tasteful interiors.
As much as the Princess of Wales liked frills and ruffles in her clothing, she also clearly liked it, judging by the interiors of Kensington Palace. And they feature very highly in the curtain treatments in particular.
In her 20s, when she is helping design Highgrove and Kensington Palace, she's a kid, more or less. And as a result, the interiors are invested with a playfulness that wouldn't otherwise be associated with royal palaces. It's fresh, it's eye-catching, and it's fun.
While Princess Diana took charge of decorating inside, Prince Charles focused on the huge task of creating his dream garden.
With Highgrove, that was the King's chance to put his own stamp right from the beginning on the garden. It was, to all intents and purposes, a pretty blank canvas.
Charles was starting from scratch. In his early 30s, he had never really gardened before.
He wasn't that interested or knowledgeable about gardening as a young man growing up. He just sort of enjoyed being in gardens. And I think he particularly enjoyed his grandmother, the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother's gardens, especially at the Castle of May, at Birkhall and at Royal Lodge. But none of those gardens were particularly innovative.
Isn't it delicious? Absolutely lovely.
So there must have been something inside of him, a sort of itch for creativity.
Kind people did do a little digging and snipping and all that sort of thing. Yes, they were all very helpful.
It is extraordinary because although the Queen Mother was known to love her gardens, you don't imagine that she was passionately, actively gardening the way King Charles has done since buying Highgrove. So obviously something triggered in him.
Charles had big ambitions and lots of ideas, and he had access to the finest gardeners in the country to help him get started.
When you're the Prince of Wales, you can call in quite a lot of favours. You can ask people for their expertise, and that's what the Prince did. In the early years, Lady Salisbury from Hatfield House gave him a lot of valuable advice.
Molly Salisbury was able to transform and put her ideas into practice, famously Hatfield in Hertfordshire. And she was an early believer in the organic movement, in not doing as was the fashion in the middle of the last century, which was to spray everything with pesticides and herbicides and rigidly control things.
Although controversial at the time, the Prince was determined that the Highgrove Gardens would follow her example and nurture nature, not fight it with chemicals.
In the 1980s, it was considered sort of madness that you would garden organically. And he was made fun of, and when he said in an interview that he spoke to his plants, and people thought, oh, this is eccentric.
One of the first areas that Charles transformed was the run-down walled kitchen garden.
It needed a bit of love, it needed a bit of TLC.
Shortly before he'd bought it, it had been used as a piggery, I think, but he felt madly in love with it from the start. I mean, he's made it a work of great beauty as well as a work which gives you great produce.
Maybe chefs would wander along to this walled garden and certainly pick produce for the Prince, who was very insistent on eating his own produce.
Another early change Charles made to the garden was planting more than half a kilometre of yew hedges around the perimeter.
The prince is normally very open, but on this occasion he insisted that it should be a very private affair. No cameras inside.
When they first moved there, they were the most photographed couple in the world. And the paparazzi used to hunker up by the drive, and then you could see right through to the garden. It wasn't a very private space, and so it was imperative to get some good hedges growing pretty fast to give them that much-needed privacy.
Charles also began a massive programme of tree planting across the estate.
From the start, he was incredibly hands-on, particularly about the gardens. And he would stand on the front doorstep with a megaphone, directing operations, like a film director.
Highgrove was beginning to take shape as the weekend home for the Prince and Princess's growing family.
In the early days, they were actually quite happy at Highgrove. It was their family home with their 2 young boys.
This was the bolt hole for fun from Kensington Palace.
The boys loved it. They had huge freedom when they were very little, climbing frames in the garden. They dressed up in their little army uniforms. There was a ball pit.
The ball pit Diana had installed into one of the outbuildings. I'm going to say a ball pit. This was a massive hole of 5 metres by 2 metres and 1 metre high of those red multicoloured plastic balls that you were thrown into. And it didn't matter who you were thrown in at some point. Diana was very much involved in that and would encourage William to push us in or push them in.
And you absolutely have this idea of them playing and Diana playing with them, and very much a freedom that they could enjoy. They had pets, they had guinea pigs, they had hamsters, they of course had horses. I mean, it's a paradise in many respects. And the kids even had their own toy Aston Martin with leather interiors and a cassette player. No expense was spared. So they had their own go-karting track.
Diana herself enjoyed go-karting. These go-karts arrived, and William and Harry were very excited, invited 3 or 4 of their friends across. And William had this sort of just William way, had actually mapped out the circuit around Highgrove, where this Highgrove Grand Prix was about to take place. But unfortunately, we carved up quite a sizable area of the Prince's wild meadow, and we repaired it. It was fun, it worked.
The Wildflower Meadow, an area of natural planting near the house, was one of the first changes Charles made to the Highgrove Gardens.
It's an amazing piece of creativity. It's full of butterflies and hoverflies and moths and bees and birds.
And it is a pleasure being in Highgrove and standing in a wildflower meadow, a path that goes through a wildflower meadow with alliums and narcissi and tulips and things coming through, which is wild and woolly, and then wildflowers in summer. It exudes passion and joy in gardening.
As Highgrove's gardens became more and more beautiful, the austere grey facade of the house, particularly the boxy balustrade built after the 1890s fire, began to stick out like a sore thumb.
Charles was never happy with the exterior, and Charles likes to fiddle. So in 1987, he had the idea, and used a graphic designer friend to implement it, of putting a pediment like this with a window, and then ionic columns at the top of the roof line, and 4 urns on the corner.
He made all sorts of quite sympathetic, modest interventions to the house. And he added an entire new extension, which gave him an opportunity to have a larger reception room and a study for his private secretary.
With these renovations, Prince Charles helps make Highgrove an elegant royal residence in the way, of course, it had never been before.
However, Highgrove was changing in more ways than one.
Highgrove was renovated in 1987. Of course, this coincided with the breakdown of Charles and Diana's relationship. So we're really seeing Highgrove move from a family house with Diana and Charles to more of Charles's domain.
Prince Charles began to spend more time at Highgrove, not just the weekends, but during the week as well.
I mean, he adored it. That was everything that he'd made it from the purchase from Macmillan way in the early 80s. And so, in that sense, it in a way reverted back to him personally.
Highgrove became Prince Charles's main home, and it soon became clear more radical changes were on the way. By the early 1990s, it was becoming clear that Highgrove was more than Prince Charles's country home. It was his passion project, particularly the gardens.
In the early 90s, I was invited to tea with Prince Charles at Highgrove. The Prince was really keen to show me his time walk, something I'd never heard of. I thought, what on earth is he going to show me? What does he mean? And he led me outside to the pathway that leads out of the back of the house. And he said the idea is he planted lots of herbs along this pathway. And as you walk and you tread on some of them, the fragrancy comes up and it is very beautiful. You can smell these delicious herbs as you walk along.
I remember him saying that this was always an ambition of his, that he wanted to walk on this time walk to get this scent of thyme and the herbs. I mean, this was classic Prince of Wales. He would give William and Harry a trowel or a fork. And I remember these trays of variegated thymes, he instructing William how to plant within the sort of cracks of the crazy paving that led from the house on a fair journey down the garden.
The time walk runs between a row of golden yews that Charles was advised to remove when he first moved in.
Golden yew was thought to be a wee bit naff.
But the Prince had always loved topiary and had a vision for this unfashionable row of yellow domes.
He was told that it wasn't a good idea to have these golden yews down the time walk. Well, he flew in the face of that and said, no, I like them and I'm going to make topiary shapes. And he allowed his gardeners to decide what shapes they wanted to do.
And it was a bit like a Mad Hatter's tea party. They could just choose any shapes they wanted.
They look like sort of igloos or a big fat melon or crowns, sort of peculiar, almost jester's crown. They're most unusual. So the whole thing, you think, gosh, I've never seen anything like this before. But it was very special.
But the garden was more than something beautiful to look at. It was a chance for the Prince to put his principles into practice.
Never let it be said that the Prince is straight down the line, ordinary. I mean, he's quite extraordinary in lots of ways. And one thing I wasn't expecting to see at Highgrove was how his sewage system worked. Again, he was very proud of the fact that it is a reed bed system.
The Prince's sewage garden uses a series of bark pits, reeds and willows to process all the wastewater from Highgrove.
They just slowly filter the water through several different levels and it just takes out all the nitrates and things like that.
The butler at the time says that the Prince of Wales wrote a memo to him saying, could you please ask guests not to put tampons and condoms down the loo as it's clogging my reed beds. So there's a rather graphic vision, but it shows how complete the king was in terms of implementing his ideas.
The Prince's nature-first principles at Highgrove went way beyond the garden.
Highgrove is not just a garden, it's also a farm, which in 1985 Prince Charles started the process of converting to fully organic methods of farming.
After 11 years of farming organically at Highgrove, during which time we have learned a great deal, notably from our mistakes, the farm really has, I think, begun to respond to the treatment, and the system is clearly working in practice. The farm is profitable, and we now have premium outlets for nearly all our products.
Those products are now so successful that Charles's Duchy Originals line, which began with bread made from Highgrove oats, is now owned by Waitrose and is the largest own-label organic brand in Britain.
Which is astonishing that this began as an idea in the Prince of Wales's head a few decades ago, and now it's nationwide.
But it wasn't all about the gardens and land. The Prince didn't neglect the house. He also decided it was time to make changes inside Highgrove.
Charles worked with a very influential interior designer called Robert Kime. Nothing matches in a Robert Kime interior, but everything is beautiful. So there's a mixture of antique furniture, Persian carpets, wonderful paintings which will be idiosyncratic, mixture of old masters, but perhaps something innovative.
Kime's designs for Highgrove would have been a far cry from the lime greens and yellows of the Dudley Poplack era.
The interiors would have had a very different colour palette, much more based on reds and browns, and a lot of textiles from the Middle East, which is an area where Robert Kime travelled extensively, buying up rugs and fabric.
The prince was clearly impressed by Robert Kime's work at Highgrove, as he asked him to decorate Clarence's house when he inherited it from the Queen Mother in 2002.
I think Clarence House is classic Robert Kime. It took a very, very sympathetic approach to the interiors. They had a real sense of comfort and familiarity, which Robert managed to summon up through combining furniture and fabrics that really made people feel at home.
The newly decorated Highgrove was much enjoyed by the prince's weekend guests, including some of his favourite entertainers.
Emma Thompson paid a visit there, Kenneth Branagh as well, Barbra Streisand, who King Charles was a huge fan of, spent some time there as well.
Barbra Streisand chose to have her breakfast in bed, and suddenly she was rather surprised when her bedroom door was thrown open to see a then Prince of Wales, Charles, searching for his lost dog Tigger. She was a bit like, oh my goodness. I think she thought that obviously everything would be stood on ceremony, including her host. But no, it's his house, he'd lost his dog, he could go anywhere he wanted to look for him.
Sometimes, however, it was the visitors' behaviour that was unpredictable.
Buckingham Palace is just up the road, and she's in. Go and get her.
One of Charles's absolute all-time favourite comedy acts is the Goons. So one of the house guests was Spike Milligan, and he spent the night sleeping on the floor of the bathroom of the Blue Room suite instead of in his bed. Perhaps too much vintage claret had been consumed that night before supper.
After his stay, he sent a plaque back to Highgrove and said, Spike Milligan slept here. Now, we're not sure if it was put on the floor in the exact spot where he slept in the Blue Suite, or it's on the mantelpiece, but he certainly wanted to remind everybody that he, comedian Spike Milligan, had stayed at Highgrove House.
Charles's most frequent visitors, however, were a group of his close friends who lived nearby and shared his love of horses and the countryside. They became known as the Highgrove set.
The set is as much a feature of Gloucestershire country houses in the 1990s as it is in the 1790s.
The Highgrove set, of course, included Camilla Parker Bowles, as she then was.
After Charles's separation and later divorce from Diana, Camilla was often present at Highgrove entertainments.
I think people were always very pleased when Camilla was there at a dinner party or an event, because she innately brought, and still does, a sense of informality, joviality, mischievousness, and general joy, actually, to the proceedings.
Camilla lived close to Highgrove in a 6-bedroom house on 17 acres called Ray Mill, just across the border in Wiltshire.
When Camilla bought Raymill House and these 17 acres of land, the garden was pretty plain, there wasn't much to it. Meanwhile, Highgrove Garden had been thriving and really been doing beautifully with all these plants and flowers. So King Charles III sent a whole bunch over to Raymill House so that Camilla could establish her gardens as well, build them up and make them as beautiful as Highgrove.
The Highgrove Gardens were definitely impressive, but for Prince Charles, the work was still unfinished.
I was going there and driving up the drive on a very wet day in the 90s. And there's a sort of wide verge at the side of it, and there's all these tree stumps, sort of higgledy-piggledy, massive great trees. I thought, what's going on? And then it dawned, this was the start of the stumpery.
It was originally a Victorian idea to have lots of tree stumps which form almost like an architectural, sculptural area, and then to grow around them and on them bulbs in the spring, and then hostas, and then ferns.
There's this weird wooden, it's like architecture, but it's just nature and the way the stumps have been laid down. It's like a magical woodland. You feel you've suddenly gone into Midsummer Night's Dream.
After more than 15 years shaping Highgrove into a very personal garden, Charles made a surprising decision.
In 1996, Charles took the rather unusual decision, really, to open his gardens to the public. I personally think it's because he was so proud of what he created. He wanted to share it. He wanted to show it to people. He wanted to inspire people.
A lot of people were beginning to realise that he had a lot to give, and a lot of people wanted to see it. Why would you keep something like that secret?
But what he had created at Highgrove was far from the formal stately gardens that people expect of a royal residence. How would the public react when he opened the gates?
Arriving in style for their tea with the princes, this way at least, the Spice Girls could ensure the visit...
One of the more surprising celebrity visits to Highgrove was in 1998, when the Spice Girls, who were clearly quite comfortable around the royals, came for tea at Highgrove with the then Prince Charles and Prince Harry.
Imagine you're obsessed with a singer, a band, and because your dad is Prince Charles, you could just invite them to tea. And I've always wanted to ask Harry, actually, was he delighted or was he mortified? Because when you're a teenage boy, it must be amazing to have your kind of a literal dream come true, to have, you know, this girl band that you adore and to come. But also, was it not mortified to have to do it with your dad? And yeah, anyway, Harry won't tell us now, will he?
I think the Spice Girls being helicoptered in for afternoon tea was definitely an interesting moment in Highgrove's history. And I mean, you had all these scores of young people at the gates queuing up for the Spice Girls, but obviously for Prince William as well.
The young fans had to wait outside without a glimpse of either the pop princesses or the real royalty. But Highgrove's gates were no longer always shut to the public. 2 years earlier, paying tour groups had started visiting the gardens.
I think visitors to Highgrove all come away with a sense of wonder, almost, that it's quite unlike the formal gardens you'd find in so many royal palaces, that in places nature has gone a bit wild.
The tour gives visitors a rare glimpse of the king's inner self.
To see a garden which has been very much made by one person is to have a window into their soul. It doesn't matter who you are. A garden that you create reflects your personality.
Like the fact that Charles has placed some of the many busts he's been gifted over the years in the hedge in the sundial garden.
He jokingly said, I think it should be called the ego garden because it's full of me, 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 me. But it's a royal garden and, you know, a lot of people want to see him. And if they don't get to see him in person, at least they can see his busts.
They looked amazing. I remember the prince saying, you know, what do you think of the bus? Well, I'm no art critic and I couldn't really say anything, but I said, what's interesting, sir, is that the sculptors all see you differently. I mean, not one sculptor is the same. And he said, yes, I know. He said, but you know what the common denominator is. And I didn't quite know what he meant. I said, what do you mean, sir? He said, well, he says, they always get my bloody ears right. And I thought it was so good of him to say that.
I had a personal tour of the Highgrove Gardens, which was such a delight because he is such an enthusiastic gardener. He told me that delphiniums are his absolute favourite. And the way he was kind of looking at them and smelling them, you could tell that this was a man who knew every plant in his garden.
Charles may only be seen in sculpture on the public tours, but he's sometimes a lot closer than visitors realise.
He's a great one for having windows open, and occasionally he's in residence when these parties come outside. He'll go up to the window and he'll listen to what they're saying. And I think once or twice he's ducked down below the window.
I'm told that sometimes after the public have visited and he's in the gardens in the evening, he'll even go around collecting rubbish using one of those grabbers. Once, apparently, whatever the rubbish was, it burst and covered him in something unpleasant. But this is real hands-on stuff from the king.
But the opening up was worth it. Charles realised that Highgrove could become a showcase for his organic beliefs and methods.
And so the orchard room was created as an entertaining space.
Built in 1998, the Orchard Room provided a visitor's centre for the garden tours, as well as a community function room and, at times, royal banqueting hall.
It's a single-storey building with a very high-pitched roof of Cotswold stone tiles, and it's got a lovely feel to it with stone-flagged floors and big old carpets.
The Orchard Room is dedicated to Charles's right-hand man at Highgrove, Paddy Whiteland, who had died the previous year.
Paddy Whiteland was part and parcel of the fixtures of Highgrove. And whenever I went there, he was always there. His loyalty, without question, was to the Prince of Wales.
You get an insight into how highly the Prince of Wales thought of Paddy Whiteland, who dedicates it to Paddy and makes a point of telling people everything I have done at Highgrove is only possible because of Paddy Whiteland's support.
Although Highgrove was opening up and being used more and more for Charles's work with his charitable foundation, it remained the family home for his now teenage sons.
The deal? We smile for the cameras now, then you leave us alone until the autumn. It is an annual event, although it's not normally conducted.
To really get away from it all, William and Harry liked to head down to the basement, where they had a private den they called Club H for Highgrove.
They managed to pilfer some furniture from different royal residences, so Persian rugs, Moroccan sofas. They had a huge, very loud, but apparently not very good stereo in there. And that's where they and their friends would gather.
And it was where they could drink. As Harry said, it was a well-stocked drink trolley, which some careful pilfering always made sure that they had beer and wine and probably gin, vodka, strong spirits. And there was a big vent, he says, so it was quite airy. It wasn't as perhaps subterranean as you might think. And he said you could smell Parr's flowers, lavender coming through. I mean, really? Could you, Harry? Could you? Or were you just a little bit, it was just the alcohol fumes?
Well, it's definitely true that scent was an important part of the royal gardens. By 2001, Highgrove had become a destination garden for the public. But what would the gardening elite think of Charles's abilities? Inspired by 2 Persian carpets in one of the rooms at Highgrove, he decided to enter the world-famous Chelsea Flower Show.
His mother, the Queen, stopped by to see his work, the so-called carpet garden.
The late Queen would acquire plants at the Chelsea Flower Show or be given them, but never before Charles was a monarch or heir involved in designing a garden. I think it got a silver medal, and I'm not sure if the Prince of Wales was pleased with that. I think he would have preferred a gold, but it was bold of him to put something out there and to be judged.
After the show, the carpet garden was installed near the orchard room at Highgrove, where it's become a visitor favourite.
You go in for the door and it's wow. There's this huge mass of colour and a fountain bowl going over an octagon, coloured tile work.
And I think the Persian carpet garden actually looks much better at Highgrove expanded than it looked at Chelsea.
But more than anything, the gardens have always been a deeply personal project for the king, a passion he now shares with Camilla.
Both Highgrove and Ray Mill have very lovely gardens now. And it was actually rather lovely that at their wedding, the flowers came from both houses. So very personal touch and showed how much that part of the country, particularly Highgrove, means so much to them.
Highgrove is now Charles and Camilla's family home. But what will happen to this favourite royal residence in the future?
Leaving Buckingham Palace for the last time on a gun carriage, the coffin of Queen Elizabeth.
The days following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022 were a very challenging time for the new king.
My life will, of course, change as I take up my new responsibilities.
But there was one place that remained a familiar source of comfort and peace.
He had a couple of days of quiet time amidst all the responsibilities of taking the throne and touring the country, and they were spent at Highgrove. It's a great battery charger, Highgrove, for the king.
The king has even built a small chapel on the grounds known as the Sanctuary. Sanctified by the Bishop of London, it's one of the few places he can be completely alone.
I know nothing about the sanctuary apart from its outside because I've never been in. Because I think the thing about the sanctuary is that it's his private space. And I think, goodness me, if anybody needs a place that nobody else goes in this life, it's him.
Despite all the changes at Highgrove, it's always been the family home. When Prince William started dating Kate Middleton in the early 2000s, they would often spend the weekend there.
There's nothing like having your photo taken on your birthday.
And there was an occasion they were in Tetbury, which is the local town about a mile away, and the crowds and the media, it has to be said, got very excited about her there and surrounded her. And so she had to take refuge in a dress shop.
Today, William and Catherine's children enjoy the freedom of Highgrove's gardens.
I remember going round the Highgrove Gardens and seeing a little plaque, and it said that it was a balsam poplar that had been planted by Prince George. Now, this was 2015, so I suspect a 2-year-old Prince George probably wasn't digging out the ground to put the tree in, but it's really sweet because it turns out that Charles and George had planted this tree together, and this tree has grown in the last 9 years really tall, just like Prince George.
Visitors on the Highgrove tour are often told about the grandchildren's garden games.
The grandchildren in their treehouse have to look out for Chompy Bob, and Chompy Bob is a slug-eating dinosaur. Who knows how Chompy Bob first came into being, but he lives in the stumpery in Highgrove Gardens.
One of the most recent additions to Highgrove is a family of life-sized elephant sculptures designed to promote the conservation work of the Elephant Family Charity, set up by Camilla's late brother, Mark Shand.
And wherever my brother is, I'm sure he's praying that they'll make a lot of money for the charity. And looking at them, I mean, how can you resist them? They are very lifelike, aren't they?
The elephants will certainly be widely seen. Highgrove now receives up to 40,000 visitors a year for garden tours and events.
So it's become very commercial. That long drive from the road now that took you up into Tetbury is far more formalised. You get shunted in by way of signs to a car park.
Highgrove has become a busy place, hosting many events and functions. Perhaps that's why even after her marriage, Camilla kept her nearby home, Ray Mill.
Ray Mill House is where Camilla, our queen, can be Camilla as she used to be, where she can put on a pair of jeans, some muddy Wellington boots, potter around the garden, have a large glass of something or other, and not worry about everything being tidy and formal and perfect.
Even though he now owns a huge portfolio of properties, Highgrove is still one of Charles's favourite places to spend his weekends.
Highgrove speaks to Charles. It's somewhere where he is master of his own kingdom. The walls have grown in his time there, the trees have grown. It's private. I think for him it's very emotional.
So much so that even when the king is away from home, he reportedly takes a bit of Highgrove with him.
So he takes a Highgrove hamper, and in that he has 6 types of honey that he has for his breakfast, along with jam and oatcakes and other bits in there as well. But also, he likes to gift hampers to people.
I suppose the question even plagues royalty, what does one give the Pope? And he goes to visit Pope Francis in 2017, and he takes with him Highgrove produce.
Yeah, but they're all homemade. They're things from that I produce.
He gave him a hamper of Highgrove products and, made sure that the Pope knew that this was all things that he made himself, all produce from Highgrove.
But even though Highgrove means so much to King Charles, it's not technically his house anymore.
A curious consequence of Charles becoming king is that he no longer has the Duchy of Cornwall, and Highgrove is part of that duchy.
The Duchy of Cornwall estate funds the Prince of Wales, not the monarch.
So now, technically, Charles is his son's tenant, which is interesting. I hope they don't fall out.
King Charles III now has to pay Prince William, who is his landlord, around £650,000 a year to live at Highgrove House.
I think you'll find the money still in the royal family.
As king, Charles has had to step back from the day-to-day management of Highgrove. He gave up the lease to the farms a few years ago, and his charitable foundation now runs the gardens, tours and events.
I think the fact that the King's Foundation is running the garden now is really a look to the future. And I think what the King's doing is making sure that Highgrove will continue to work and that it's safe and it's secure.
That doesn't mean Charles has hung up his trowel, of course.
The king, even while convalescing from his cancer, has been gardening and has been ordering new trees for Highgrove.
He's taking what he learnt at Highgrove to his other property portfolios: Dumfries House, Sandringham, Buckingham Palace.
We're going to have a turn.
The gardens at Buckingham Palace are quite boring, and that there's a lot more wildflower meadows now and a lot more nature and naturalism at Buckingham Palace, and that's literally come from Highgrove, because that really was like his practice garden, so to speak.
But what will happen to Highgrove in the future?
Highgrove has been so influential as a kind of idea and so remarkable as a landscape. I think it will continue to be open to the public for decades to come.
It may be that one of the new generation will one day want to live there. I mean, we have George, we have Charlotte, we have Louis. And of course, for George, it really would be like going home, because he's got his own little corner of the garden and the tree he planted when he was a very young little boy. So who knows?
One thing's for sure, the king may have transformed Highgrove, but the once humble country house has also had an impact on the king.
The king has been working on Highgrove for a good 40 years. It's not just his garden, it's really the heart of all his environmental concerns, all his passions. And I think the king's legacy will be not just the garden, but the whole environmental concerns that really are spin-offs from the garden.
But more than anything, it's been a personal haven and sanctuary.
As king, he has many palaces at his disposal, but he'd never had a home that he could call his own and could mould and transform. And that's what Highgrove has been for him. And I think in difficult times, it's been a refuge. It was a wonderful site for his kids to grow up. It's been really, really important, both in mind and soul, and for his stability.
Highgrove may have started life as an ordinary country manor house, but today it can claim a place in the first rank of royal residences. Its now stunning grounds are a mecca for garden lovers and royal fans alike. But at the centre of it all is the house, a very personal home for the king and his family. Here, in its relaxing, comfortable rooms, he can step away from royal duties and truly be himself.
Next Saturday, visit another of the King's favourite places to hang out, Clarence House, a royal residence at 7:30. Next tonight, putting on his best clobber to take us on a tour of one of his favourite places, J. Blades in brand new The West End, Through Time.